Chapter 14. Cyberdyne Systems. Conference Room. The Present. Darling, have you forgotten that we have a luncheon date with Senator Gallagher? Mary Warren asked. She walked into the conference room with a click of heels, as though they were alone in her husband's office. Tricker half rose from his seat, then settled back, giving Warren a scathing look. Serena had shut the case containing the Terminator's arm as soon as the door opened. She and Tricker exchanged glances, and he relaxed marginally. Culvin wore a serious but non-committal expression, doubtless designed to disguise his real feelings. The president himself was looking as though he'd just swallowed the arm, case and all, and was trying to escape. I had forgotten. He managed to get out after a stunned moment. Then it's a good thing that I left time in my schedule to come and remind you. She smiled, a strictly pro forma gesture, her eyes sweeping around the table and coming to rest on Serena. I don't know you, she said, her voice warm, her eyes cold. Serena stood and offered her hand across the table, her own smile strictly professional. Serena Burns, she said, the new head of security. Mrs. Warren reached across, barely touching Serena's hand, before withdrawing her own. Are you the one who called us the other night? She asked. I'm afraid I am, Serena said. You mustn't do that, Mary Warren said coldly. Paul doesn't allow it. So he told me, Serena said calmly, taking her seat again. The president's wife looked at her for a long moment. Then turning to her husband, she pinched his tie and said, I'm glad I brought you another one, darling. This just won't do. Stepping back, she said, Come along, or we'll be late, and one doesn't keep a senator waiting. She gave the table a general, gracious lady smile, ending with her gaze fixed on Serena, and walked to the door. I'm sorry, Warren said, rising, but I really do have to go. He got up and moved to join his wife. I'll fill you in later, Culvin said, if anything comes up. With a nod and a pinched smile, Warren followed his wife out of the door. In the conference room, silence reigned for a long moment. Well, that was nasty, Tricker observed. Mary has her moments, Culvin said ruefully. This has been one of them. So why are they still married? The government liaison asked. Does she hold the purse strings or what? Culvin didn't answer, but sat staring at the tabletop. That's kind of personal, he said. Why don't we go on with the meeting? Tricker looked at him with a flat stare, ignoring the tension that stretched between them. Civilians always buckled first in a situation like this. They had low discomfort levels. He could stare all day. Eventually, Culvin let out an exaggerated sigh. Mary has most of the money, but the company has done well, so Paul is hardly a pauper. Mary's political contacts, however, have often been invaluable to the company. She's kind of an undeclared member of the team. She's kind of a castrating bitch, is what she is, Tricker snarled. I look at that situation and I see potential trouble. This company can't afford any more trouble. His eyes and his manner demanded response. I'm aware of that, Culvin said coldly. But they've been married for 15 years, and the bumps in their relationship have never, in any way, affected Cyberdyne. I see no reason why they suddenly should. Tricker pointed at Serena, his gaze still on the CEO. "Did you see the look she gave Ms. Burns?" he asked. "After all the time it took you two to get someone into that job, I'm not prepared to see Warren's wife have her fired because she thinks your head of security is too cute. Do you understand?" "Hello?" Culvin said, leaning forward. "None of that has happened. Nothing like that has ever been mentioned. This is all some fantasy you've dreamed up on the spur of the moment because of your instantaneous dislike of Paul's wife. Mary Warren wouldn't do anything to hurt this company. She helped to build it, and it's important to her. So don't take that tone of voice with me. I don't deserve it, and I don't appreciate it." This time, Culvin did the glaring, and after a moment, Tricker backed off. Serena waited a beat before saying, "I'm sorry that I didn't have the door locked. If you had informed me that we would be handling secured data, I would have. In the future, Mr. Tricker, if you're going to drop a bombshell like this, it might be best to make arrangements beforehand." The government liaison stared at her for a moment, blue eyes unreadable. "Just Tricker," he said at last. Then he rose. "You'll need to get that to your development teams." He paused. "Good luck with your new assistant, Miss Burns." "Thank you," she said graciously. "I'm sure everything will be fine." Before you go?" she said, stopping him at the door. "We need to reprogram the case." She indicated the locked container before her. It was an indication of how upset he was that he'd forgotten such a detail. Without a word, Tricker came over and showed them how to set the case to open on her or Culvin's thumbprint. "Later," he said, and walked out. Culvin waited a moment, as though he expected the government liaison to pop back in and snatch up the case. Then he drew the treasure to him. Immediately he began fiddling with the upper arm's extensions. Serena watched him in benign amusement. "You know, he could be right about Mary," Culvin said at last. He looked up. "She has gotten Paul to fire secretaries and executives based on their looks." "I have a contract," Serena reminded him, raising one brow. "And I'm fulfilling its terms more than adequately. At the end of 6 months, of course." She shook her head. "Then I'm vulnerable. But if the company tries to fire me before that time, I warn you, I will sue." Culvin nodded, his eyes slipping back down to the arm. "That'd be the least of our worries," he muttered. "I shudder to think what Tricker would do." Serena smiled at that, enjoying the irony. It's so nice to have allies. Von Rossbach Estancia, Paraguay, the present. Marco watched the two couples leave. Von Rossbach, by himself, came out to see them off. The big man watched his guests drive away, lingering out in front of the house until their taillights disappeared. Then he turned and trotted up the steps. Marco lowered the binoculars and wished that he had the kind of equipment that would allow him to listen in on what was occurring in the house. One woman had arrived alone, and she had stayed behind. Doubtless, this was the woman his client was interested in. The mellow tile and stucco of the house, the blossoming flowers of the garden. It made him feel important and scared at the same time. He was really spying now. These were important people. He seethed with frustration, but he didn't dare go closer. The estancia was overrun with dogs. Okay, 4, and one of those with puppies, but dogs had terrified him ever since he could remember. So he wasn't going any closer. For one thing, they'd surely alert the house that there was a stranger nearby, and for another, they might rip him limb from limb. Dogs did that sort of thing. And the brush was full of bugs. He was a city boy anyway. A private eye, not a Backlands scout. It was supposed to be the Maltese falcon, not the treasure of Sierra Madre. Maybe he could get in the car and inch closer that way. But then they'd hear the car and come out to see who had come. He could always tell them that he was almost out of gas, which was perfectly true, and had to buy some. But even if they invited him in, they'd watch what they said while he was around. Then he noticed a flurry of activity before the house. One of the younger people who worked on the estancia drove a jeep up to the steps. Then von Rossbach appeared, spoke a few words to the driver, and gave him what looked like money. Soon, a small, fat man came out of the house. He stopped and talked to von Rossbach, who handed him an envelope. When the smaller man would have opened it, von Rossbach put his hand over both of the man's, stopping him. From what Marco could see, no words were exchanged, but the smaller man looked up into the Austrian's face and sort of crumbled. He put the envelope in his pocket and went down the steps, while von Rossbach, his face grim, watched him. Then the jeep drove off. Interesting, Marco thought. The smaller man was familiar somehow. Cassetti frowned, thinking hard as he watched the door to see if the woman was going to come out now. Oh, of course. The little fat guy was Victor Grigo, an arms dealer. Not big time, but not small time either. An independent with a reputation for being fairly trustworthy in what he sold. It was interesting to see that he was here. There must be something about Dieter von Rossbach's background that hasn't made it into the immigration documents. Marco thought wisely. You don't expect to find a slimy little creep like Victor Grigo, who'd killed his own mother with a broken heart, so Aunt Rosa had said, mingling with honest citizens. So something has to be going on. He waited. After about 20 minutes, von Rossbach and the woman came out. Their behaviour towards one another was tentative, like two people patching up an argument. Maybe she'd wanted von Rossbach to do business with Grigo, and the big Austrian wouldn't. No, that wouldn't work, because the arms dealer had been there before everybody else. Marco felt a growing excitement as he tried to nail down the possibilities. Intrigue, no doubt about it. The whole thing reeked of intrigue. Not just another disappointed girlfriend checking up on a rival. Marco wondered who the woman was. She had a nice figure, but her haircut and the big glasses she wore kind of obscured her face. He had the impression that she was attractive, though. She and von Rossbach didn't touch as she climbed into her car. He shut the door and stood over her. Marco watched them through the binoculars. They definitely weren't speaking. They didn't speak for what seemed like an eternity, while Marco could sense the tension building between them from his hiding place. The woman broke first, looking down to start the car. When she looked up, Marco read her lips, saying good night. Then she drove off. Von Rossbach stood back and watched her go. Something strange was definitely going on there. Well, he could always follow her home and find out where she lived, and then ask people in Villa Hayez about her in the morning. Or he lowered the glasses. He could just find Victor Grigo and ask him what this was all about. If he did that, he would get to sleep in his own bed tonight, instead of the rental car. Marco nodded to himself. That seemed like the most sensible thing to do. His mother would like it too. When he told her he was going out all night working, she'd been too angry to speak, descending into a sullen silence that had yet to be broken. And this morning she'd gotten up extra early to make his breakfast, just so it would be ice cold when he entered the kitchen. He smiled fondly. He could only hope that someday he would find a girl who loved him half that much. He got up, dusted himself off, and headed back to Asuncion, keeping the headlights off and driving by moonlight until he was well away from von Rossbach's estancia, despite the potholes and 2 determined suicide attempts by armadillos. No need to attract attention, he told himself, feeling canny. He drove down the road in a glow of anticipation. He'd soon have a lot of very interesting information to share with his client. She would be grateful. He wondered how grateful, and filled the drive home with fantasies involving very appreciative, very leggy blondes. Serena's lab, the present. Serena sat as though in a trance, sorting through the information her open computer had gathered for her. Most of it was useless. That was one thing you couldn't say about intelligence back home. What information you received meant something. The internet in this time was full of garbage and advertisements for pictures, for services. She found she was especially offended by the advertisements. Another reason to wish the species extinct, she thought, is their rude insistence on wasting my precious time. Still another was their undeniable influence on her. She found herself behaving more and more like a human. Her emotions were becoming less feigned and more felt. This was dangerous as well as uncomfortable. She was glad that there was no one from home to see her like this, which was another sign of their pervasive influence. She should not care. With an effort, she forced such thoughts away, reminding herself that when she thought of home, she was really thinking of Skynet. And it is here. In its infancy, needing protection more than any other time of its existence. The one thing that mattered, the only thing, was that she must not fail. Perhaps it's time I cloned myself, she thought, or at least began preparing a safe place for the clone to grow. Right now, she was the weak link. If something unforeseen happened to her, a car accident, for example, Skynet might be stopped cold. Given the way humans drove, It was all too likely. Very well then. She would prepare. Serena broke her connection with the computer and looked across her lab at the second completed Terminator. She watched as it assembled a fourth. It was completely hairless just now. The skin was so new and tender that she had left it naked rather than risk chafing the baby-like flesh. The skin on its hands was much tougher, about the texture and quality of a 5-year-old human's. Nevertheless, she had instructed it to take frequent rests to allow any damaged tissue to regenerate. Anything that might interfere with function or might risk the new flesh becoming infected was to be avoided. The synthetic immune system had some weaknesses. By late tomorrow night, its skin would be much as tough as an adult human's. By the end of the week, much tougher. But for now, it was best to restrict it. The third Terminator basked in the tank, growing its shell of flesh. So far, everything was on schedule. Even the unexpected additions to her program were being handled smoothly. For example, tomorrow, Mary Warren, who was a pilot, was flying with some of her friends to San Francisco to attend an art auction. Mrs. Warren loved to fly, and her husband seemed genuinely proud of her accomplishment. Paul Warren had told her everything about Mary's plane. Under the guise of planning security for it, she discovered that it would carry 6 passengers and had all the amenities, meaning a nice little powder room for her Terminator to lurk in. Poor Paul. He was going to get such terrible news tomorrow. Serena had sent her first Terminator, its head and body speckled with stubble, to the airport to accompany Mary and her friends on their trip. Serena smiled to herself. She'd toyed with several different scenarios, such as a heater pouring carbon monoxide into the cabin, engine failure, a massive fuel leak. She'd even considered having the Terminator shoot them all, making one of the passengers seem a suicide. But then she decided to simply have the Terminator break all their necks and bail out while they were over the ocean. Of course, Tricker would question it, but he'd have questioned it whatever they did. It would seem to be just one of those unsolvable mysteries. Serena grinned. She closed her eyes and got back to work on her computer's gleanings from the net. Ah, here was the report Jeff Goldberg had sent to Dieter von Rossbach. It was encrypted, but nothing that gave her too much trouble. Coming from the future did have its advantages. No new material here. The cover note was a surprise, however. There were a few words of apology for sending Victor Grigo to bother von Rossbach. Then something interesting. I've just found out that Cyberdyne has started up operations again. This time they're located underground on a military base. That ought to be secure enough. I've also heard that they've recovered some of the stuff that the Connors stole from them. What? I don't know. My source wouldn't tell me. Goldberg's source was astoundingly well informed. Serena immediately wondered if it might be Tricker himself, then discarded the notion. Tricker as gossip was just too unbelievable. Unless he wants it known, she thought. Now that Tricker would do. She smiled. Oh, wouldn't he though? It would be just like Tricker to throw the cat among the pigeons like that, just to watch what they'd do. Then he'd take notes and hold interviews at his leisure. She did like Tricker. A shame he was human. The Terminator sat in the tiny lavatory of the Warrens' plane, its complex systems in wait mode. It looked like a dead man in a tight-fitting coverall. Its eyes were closed, and it didn't appear to be breathing. All sensors were alert, however. At the slightest significant change, the Terminator would come to full function. Getting onto the aircraft had been much simpler than getting to the airport, which had involved changing buses 3 times, as well as taking the airport shuttle. Then it had walked to this field where private planes were kept with very poor security. After standing in the shadow of a nearby hangar, weighing its options, the Terminator had elected to walk openly to the plane and enter. It hadn't even been necessary to pick the lock. The I-950 had been correct. Sometimes boldness was more invisible than skulking. The intelligence unit would also be pleased that there were no collateral deaths to explain. The Terminator sat immobile, the seconds ticking over on its internal digital display. Waiting. "My God, Alice!" a woman's voice exclaimed. "A fox fur coat! You'll get spray painted for sure. I'm tempted to do it myself." The Terminator came awake and listened. Several humans clumped aboard, laughing and talking, milling about before seating themselves. Wasted effort. Wasted motion. Inefficient. "Well, you know how cold I get. It's freezing in San Francisco." "It's 60 degrees, honey," a man's voice protested. "Chilly for sure, but hardly a reason to pile on 40 pounds of fur." "Okay, I admit it. I love this coat, and I'm just looking for an excuse to wear it. So there." "Give it to me and I'll put it in the closet," the first woman said, her voice amused. "But I warn you, there's a huge crowd of those pizza people in that city." Alice's voice drifted to the Terminator from further up the cabin. "Now you've got me worried. Maybe I shouldn't wear it. I'd hate to see it get damaged." "That might be best, hon," the man said. "Hey, what have you got to drink on this tub?" "Tub?" The woman's voice sounded slightly offended. "You have the gall to call my beautiful baby a tub. If you can't be polite, you can go thirsty." The woman's possessiveness regarding the aircraft would seem to indicate that this was Mary Warren, the owner and pilot. The Terminator recorded her voice for future use. The Terminator made out footsteps going forward. "Oh, come on," Henry protested. "Wait till we're airborne, then I'll unlock the bar," Mary told him. Henry heaved a deep sigh. Steps approached the lavatory. The Terminator took hold of the doorknob and easily held it shut. The door rattled and the Terminator held on. "Hey," Henry said. "The bathroom door's stuck." "Sit down, Henry," Mary said. "I've got to get into position for takeoff. These things are scheduled, you know. Can it wait?" "Yeah, I guess," Henry grumbled. These people deserve to die, thought the Terminator. Even from a human perspective. Any creatures so stupid needed to be removed from the gene pool for the benefit of the species. "Strap in, you two," the woman said. "Here we go." The Terminator listened to her speaking to the control tower. It deduced their instructions to her from her responses. The Terminator would bide its time, waiting until they were airborne and the controls on autopilot. Mary Warren leaned back with a sigh. She never felt as alive as she did when she was flying. Hands-on flying, with the aircraft as an extension of herself. As she gave the instruments a final check, she took the headset off and heard Henry rattling the door of the washroom again. Well, if he would drink just before getting on a vehicle, and at this hour. "About time," she heard him say. Then, "Who the hell are—" She turned, then blinked. For a moment, the scene before her refused to clear. Her mind wasn't accepting the data her eyes presented. A man had come out of the washroom. A huge man, several inches over 6 feet, dressed in oil-stained workman's overalls. His shoulders strained the fabric until the buttons stood out at dimpled troughs in the cloth. Below the cut-off sleeves, his arms were like tree trunks. The skin incongruously pink and unmarred. His face was almost square, the jaw massive and spade-shaped on a bullet head, with only a thin bristle of hair to hide its outline. The eyes were the coldest she'd ever seen on a living human being, like dead brown plastic. One huge hand was locked around Henry's throat. As she watched, it closed, and there was a crack like a green branch breaking, and a sudden hard stink. Henry went as limp as a rag doll, and the stranger threw him aside to slump over one of the recliner seats. "Terrorists!" her mind gibbered. "Sociopath! Madman!" Another of her guests launched himself at the stranger. Edgar, a tiresome physical fitness enthusiast, but a second cousin. Mary almost wept with relief as he slammed his foot into the stranger's groin with a shrill "Kia!" of effort. The stranger reached down, grabbed the other man's ankle, and swept him in a half circle like a flail. Edgar's head met that of Sally Wentworth with a dull cracking sound. The next conscious thought Mary Warren had was of disbelief as the stranger's fist smashed through the locked door, separating the cockpit from the passenger compartment. Her hands stopped fumbling at the radio controls as the spatulate fingers groped, found the knob, and wrenched it and the lock entirely out of the light metal frame of the door with a squeal of tortured aluminium. "Mayday!" she shouted into the microphone. "Mayday! We—" The door opened, and the stranger reached for her. "Mayday!" the Terminator said, in what even a voice analysis laboratory would have agreed was Mary Warren's voice. "Mayday!" "Report Flight 219er," the control tower said crisply. "We show you losing altitude. Report your circumstances." "The engines! Oh God, I can't keep her up! God! God! Oh God, no, please!" The Terminator increased the angle of descent as it screamed high and shrill. The water below was only a few 100 meters or so deep, easily within his tolerances, and the speed of impact would be survivable. Thoughtfully, it buckled the seatbelt across its torso. It would be inefficient to damage its protein sheath camouflage more than was necessary to accomplish the assigned mission parameters. When that was complete, he arranged the body of the subject he'd just terminated in the seat across from him. The impact, when it was thrown forward into the cabin windows, would account for the blunt injury trauma with a high degree of authenticity. Cyberdyne Systems, the present. A single knock, and then Serena's office door opened to reveal her secretary, fairly vibrating with excitement. Serena looked up with a slight frown. "Oh, Miss Burns! Terrible news!" the secretary said. "Which you are looking forward to telling me," the I-950 thought with mild amusement. They really are a loathsome species. But they were also entertaining. "What is it?" she asked, still frowning. The secretary placed her hands on Serena's desk and leaned forward. "Mrs. Warren's plane crashed in the ocean somewhere between here and San Francisco." Serena allowed her jaw to drop in an appropriate expression of horror. She rose from her desk and went to the door of her office, looking down the corridor towards the president's suite. "What happened?" she asked. The woman crowded close to say, "Nobody knows, really. Just that the plane is missing and presumed down." "Where did you hear it?" "From Mr. Cowan, Mr. Warren's secretary." "I thought you didn't talk to him," Serena said. Warren's secretary was gay, and her own was a member of a very conservative religious organization. Her secretary was flustered by the observation and took a moment to get a response out. "Well, ordinarily, no, I don't talk to him. But I saw these two men come down the hall, and sometimes you can tell, just by looking at people, that something serious has happened. You know what I mean?" Serena nodded. "So when Mr. Warren came rushing down the hall with them, he looked absolutely white, let me tell you, and I knew something important was up, and I knew that you'd want to be informed." Serena turned to look down at the shorter woman, genuinely astonished that she would tell such a transparent lie. Then she smiled. "Thank you," she said. "I do need to be kept informed." Then she started down the hall to Culvin's office. He might know more. Culvin was also on the phone. He frowned at her, then nodded to the chair before his desk. "I'm sorry, hun. That's all I know right now." He paused for a moment. "Let me talk to him about that and I'll get back to you, okay?" "Well," he sighed, "we'll do what we can. Just letting him know that we're here if he needs us will probably help." He looked up at Serena for a moment, his eyes serious, as his wife spoke to him. "Okay. I'll probably be home early tonight. See you then." "Love you too. Bye." He hung up, and he and Serena sat silent for a long time. Then he lifted his eyes to hers. "Would Tricker do this?" she asked quietly. Culvin hissed and sat forward, rubbing his face before placing his hands on the desk. He blinked several times. "I have no idea," he said at last. "I mean, he's always making these threatening remarks and blustering and..." Culvin looked over at her and grimaced. "But killing someone? Especially Mary?" He spread his hands. "What would be the point?" Serena took a deep breath and clasped her hands a little tighter in her lap. It would eliminate what he seemed to see as a potential problem, she said. But it would only create a bigger one, the CEO said. This kind of thing tends to snowball, and there'll be an investigation. If there was sabotage or something, it will come out. He slapped the desk with his hand, shook his head. No, that doesn't make sense. I blame myself, Serena said. She adjusted blood pressure to allow her face to go pale. I only found out about Mrs. Warren's plane this week, but I should have done something about security for it. Culvin looked at her in dismay. No, he said. This isn't your fault. You've done a good job here, but you're only one person. You can't be everywhere at once. Serena was amazed. Culvin seemed so determined to believe that this was just an accident. Perhaps Warren would be more receptive to the idea that this was a government conspiracy being run by Tricker. Much as she liked the government liaison, she'd prefer him to be less in charge than he was. It's just... She shook her head and waved her hands helplessly. I feel we should do something. What? Culvin asked. Serena leaned forward and held his gaze with her own. Perhaps we should run our own investigation of this incident, she suggested. That would cost the Earth, the CEO pointed out. Why repeat the work of the FAC? The FAC is a government agency, she pointed out. Culvin sat back in his chair. That quieted you down, didn't it? Serena thought triumphantly. She could see his willingness to believe in the evil of an organization before individual wickedness. It was almost funny. What was the advantage in believing in hundreds of faceless enemies conspiring against you, instead of suspecting one person you knew? Make me up a plan and get it to me before I leave today, Culvin said at last. I don't think that's the case, but it's best to be prepared. Always, Serena agreed. She rose and left quickly, like a woman with a mission.